I've been working on therapeutic fads for about 13 years. And I started my research looking at happiness. And at that time, I didn't really characterize it as a therapeutic fad, but I do now. And I'll kind of go through some of the reasons why I think that's the case. Um, but my research mostly looks at social problems and the rise of emotional vocabularies that are increasingly used as panaceas for social problems. So they offer these kind of magic bullets to social issues, these wicked issues of our times. Well, if only we could just promote self-esteem or make people happy or teach them the true ways of pursuing these things, then all these problems will disappear. But I'm also interested in the way that therapeutic fads are related to each other, the way that one thing gives way to the next, and also the way that they provide problems, not just in terms of society, social problems, and are of interest, therefore, to governments and become very powerful in policy, but also within as magic bolts for personal issues and for problems in institutions and in workplaces. So in our context, perhaps the wicked issue might be the chronically unhappy worker stubbornly asking for more when money doesn't make you happy. But my project for the last 5 years has been looking at the rise and fall of what I call therapeutic fads, and in particular, the tendency toward promoting positive emotions and positive emotional orientations as a solution to a wide variety of issues. And I think it's worthwhile to interrogate at first why we're even talking about happiness in the first place. And I think that I think generally these positive emotional orientations, self-esteem, happiness, well-being, mental health, even mindfulness now, became powerful at a time when our vocabulary for making sense of social issues began to get smaller and smaller. And our vocabulary for connecting with people has got smaller. So policymakers, for example, can't count on a constituency of communists or socialists or libertarians or Muslims or Christians. Although those identities may be powerful to individuals, they certainly present much less of a mass appeal than they might have done in the past. And therefore, we have increasingly used the language of emotion to connect with people at the lowest common denominator. I don't know what your religion is. I don't know what your politics are, but I do know you've got a brain. If I can use that language, the language of the mind and the language of emotion, I'll be able to connect with you at that level. And I think it's not, and I think that's part of what has, there's lots of obviously things that have fed into this, but I think that has that general kind of loss of these broader kind of vocabularies for making sense of social issues. So we no longer talk about things in terms of social class. Even when we try to talk about discrimination, it tends to be in terms of interpersonal issues. So we just got to go into people's minds and just teach them to think the right way, and all of these inequalities will disappear. And that sort of older kind of sociological imagination of thinking about things in much deeper, broader terms, in terms of like historical, for example, in immigration policy, when sociologists talk about institutional racism, we don't mean lots of people in that institution are racist. We mean that there's a long history that has embedded racist practices within that institution. And you can be a real nice person, but your job of ticking boxes and filling out forms reproduces racism. We're not really comfortable with talking about that. It seems very difficult. And so the language of the interpersonal has become the key to much of life. So happiness also became powerful because who's going to argue against it? It's got the power to transport potentially divisive conversations onto a highly agreeable terrain. Once you start talking about happiness, the options for dissent are fewer. What are people going to say? No, we should all be depressed. Or, the idea that money doesn't buy happiness, which was one of the big claims that I identified in my earlier study of happiness in the book that was mentioned at the outset. This idea that money doesn't buy happiness, this was the big claim that became very powerful and kind of led the movement. Who's going to say, money is the most important thing in life? But of course, when people organize at a grassroots level, they kind of do ask for that. I mean, when you don't go on a picket line begging your employer to pay you less or to give you well-being Wednesdays. You're asking for more money. So there's a kind of agreeableness to this that hides a deeper kind of tensions in society that are at play. And so this kind of vocabulary becomes very powerful because it offers to harmonize that. But I'm not sure that it can ultimately solve these problems or harmonize these kinds of relationships, these deep tensions within society. And I also think that happiness promotion and well-being promotion and so on also comes with a number of downsides. For instance, encouraging the view that happiness is the be all and the end all, the great purpose in life. Of course it is, right? That's what we're all pursuing. Can produce a kind of, or instigate or encourage excessive self-attention. So all of these, biohacking and, the music and the way that I position things, it's to make me happier. You think about it all the time. Am I happy enough? Why aren't I happy enough? And actually, part of my sort of critical interest in happiness comes from my own, personal experience. I think, I did my undergrad in anthropology, and I always think like to fully understand something, you have to believe it first before you can come out of it and question it. And I 100% was totally into like the happiness movement when I was younger. I put affirmations up on my wall. Don't save your happiness up for the future. Be happy now. And I was like, why can't I just be happy? I was thinking about myself all the time. I was thinking about my own emotions all the time. And then one day, I happened to come across this whole critical literature that said, well, actually, this stuff has a history. And our ways of being and existing in the world have been different. We didn't always have this kind of self attention. That we don't, this isn't just like the product of a scientific discovery. This is how human beings should behave and think. It actually has a history, it's embedded in the economy and so on. And all of a sudden, I had a greater purpose beyond myself, which I've heard a few people talking about, right? I was very happy to hear about Viktor Frankl, but Viktor Frankl wasn't saying we should seek meaning because it makes us happy. Frankl was saying we should seek meaning because it makes suffering worthwhile. It makes suffering bearable. People don't, journalists don't go on hunger strikes because for greater press freedom because it's going to make them happy. They do it even though they know they may die because it's worthwhile. The end goal matters. And so I think this is a common claim that happiness should be a byproduct of some greater pursuit, but it's the greater pursuit that matters. And in fact, you pursue it not because it makes you happy, but because it might make you miserable, but it's worth it. So it's, I think also part of the reason, one thing that it's a kind of a bigger debate, but another reason why this has become powerful is this broader kind of loss of meaning. This loss of larger quests, collective visions. We all have our own personal utopia that we're pursuing. And I think that's, ultimately when the anchor for meaning is inside you rather than beyond yourself, any kind of suffering becomes unbearable because it's an attack on your whole purpose in life, which is to sustain a particular kind of emotional orientation. So those are some of the downsides of happiness. And I think because of the way that happiness emerged into society and some of the similarities that it has with previous movements and the way that it's giving way to other kinds of vocabularies, I think kind of hints at the fact that it's not necessarily a social movement, it is a therapeutic fad. And in this way, how do I recognize that? Well, fads tend to go through these kinds of periods of emerging, surging, and purging, or in my research, my current research, I kind of break that down into discovery, adoption, expansion, and exhaustion. So a new fad is discovered, often by kind of downplaying the old fad. In fact, a lot of the early claims makers for happiness were critics of the self-esteem movement. And this is the new thing. We're going to, the claims were very similar. Self-esteem advocates said we're going to inoculate young people from future problems if we just teach them to have self-esteem. Martin Seligman said that happiness would be an inoculation. The self-esteem movement called it a social vaccine. Seligman called it an inoculation. It's the new thing, great fanfare, it's novel. Then more people adopt it, it spreads, and people are enthusiastic. People want to be seen to be doing something about the new thing. And then it starts to expand. The meanings attached to happiness start to expand. The things that it can be applied to start to expand. In sort of social problems theory, we say everything starts to look like a nail. Once you've got this new discourse, you just start looking for something new that you can apply it to. And then finally, it becomes exhausted. After it loses its novelty, I remember there was a headline in Newsweek that said, happiness, enough already. Once it expands so much, it starts to mean so much. People start to say, well, if it means everything, then it really means nothing. If it solves everything, then it solves nothing. And then we move on to the next fad. But the exhaustion phase isn't actually influenced by critique, because in my research, I see criticism. So I study the claims made around all of these fads, and criticism is there all the time. But what happens when it's exhausted is, one, the criticism starts to be noticed, but two, we're on to the next big thing.